Hello, everyone. My name is Princess Senate, Conference Producer for Technology Networks, and I am here to introduce the final talk of the day, Are Alternative Proteins the Solution to Sustainability? I am pleased to welcome our speaker, Dr. Claire Munialo. Claire is a food scientist who has a PhD from Wageningen University in the Netherlands. Following her graduation, she has worked in various institutions as a postdoctoral research fellow, and in recent years, her focus has mainly been on lecturing in food and nutrition, and is currently a senior lecturer in food science at Harper Adams University. Her goal is to understand whether alternative proteins are indeed the solution to sustainability. And to achieve this, Claire continues to research on the techno-functional properties of a range of alternative proteins, such as fungal, plant, and insect proteins, among others. A warm welcome to you, Claire. Following the presentation, we will have a Q&A session, and we welcome any questions that you may have. Please ask questions using the Q&A system to the right-hand side of the video player. You can also use this feature to connect with attendees and discuss the talk. So feel free to take advantage of the chat system by introducing yourself and sharing your thoughts during this presentation. You can also benefit from some fantastic supporting literature from which you can download for free below the video player. If you experience any technical difficulties during the presentation, please request help using the technical help icon in the menu on the left-hand side of the player. I will now hand over to Claire to begin her presentation.
Thank you very much, Princess, for your kind introduction, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is good to have you come and join along for this presentation. As Princess has already mentioned, my research is mainly focusing on alternative proteins, and it's an absolute joy tonight for me to present something on this question, whether alternative proteins are the solution to sustainability. We know that globally, there have been these questions and issues about animal production, and there has been an increased discussions around the issue to do with the greenhouse gas emissions that the animal production continues to contribute. And you will imagine that and think that it's going to result in a reduction in global meat production. However, as you can see, I'm just going to go straight into the whole issue and look at the global meat production, where there's an analysis that has been done by the Food and Agriculture Organization to show the trends in the global production of meat between 1961 and 2018. As you can see from this graph that are presented here, meat supply per person does seem to continue to increase, and of course in terms of the cost of production, with those kind of what the so-called Western world leading in terms of the meat supply per person. And you can see here, for example, the United States being one of the highest meat supply per person in terms of meat production in this whole graph that you can see here. And then you have also the so-called developing countries coming in a little bit and increasing still the number of how much is spent in terms of the global meat production. But when you think about this, you'll think that probably with all the information that is continuing and all the meetings, for example, the COP28 meeting that was in Egypt a couple of months ago, that could be that we are starting to reduce the consumption and reduce the production. Obviously, if you're producing meat, it means that there is demand and need for it so that you can supply that demand with the production. If we look at the next slide, between 1961 and 2021, and again look at it from the different continents around the world, obviously the amount of meat that is being produced doesn't seem to kind of reduce. We see like an increasing trend. There was a little bit dip around 2020, which of course you will remember was the time when we had the global pandemic, and obviously this had issues in terms of the food supply chain, and of course because of that, in some cases it was difficult to get the sourcing of the meat. And of course after the pandemic, you see here that there is that continuous increase in the production, and I'll be more than interested to see how the values look at, because this was the latest data that I was able to grab hold of last year. And when you start to think about that, you'll be like, So why is it globally there is so much information, there is so much communication going on around the whole concept of global warming, around the whole concept of let's do something to reduce the greenhouse emissions that are being produced every year. But then if we are continuing to produce more animals or to produce more meat, what is it that is happening in terms of the global, the greenhouse gas emissions? So let's look a little bit into these in terms of the greenhouse emissions and try to differentiate this or separate these on all these global emissions based on the food and the non-food emissions. And underneath this graph, you can see there is the food supply, which of course does contribute 26% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, those non-food, for example, the transport, etc., will contribute 74% of those greenhouse gas emissions. If you start to break this down in terms of the food production, and you begin to look at it from dividing the animal-related products versus the plant-based products, it does clearly show that things like livestock and fishery accounts to around 31% of that 26% production of greenhouse gas. If you look at it in terms of things like, again, the animal feed that we produce from crops, again, accounts for about 8%. Land use for just rearing the animals where you have them in the field or wherever you're using to rear them contributes around 14%. And then we have the supply chain of animal products, which contributes about 6%, which can include, of course, things like transportation, food mileage, etc. And then if you look at it on the reverse side, things like plant-based foods, they seem to have a slightly low, but when you start to look at them, these values a little bit more into detail, for example, the crops for human consumption, they produce around 23% of that food emission or greenhouse gas emission from foods. Things like the food supply chain of plant-based foods is actually kind of double of what is needed in terms of the animal-related products. And that's something, again, that we need to think about. And this intrigues me and makes me wonder whether alternative proteins, such as plant-based proteins, are actually the solution for sustainability. We know that when it comes to livestock-based methane gas emission, as you can see from that figure there, most of this is actually from the bulging. So it's much more into once the cow has regurgitated its food, and then the gases that are produced as it's bulging, we get around 95% of greenhouse gases. And of course, from the manure and the defecation of the cow is about 5%. That's quite a lot of greenhouse gas emission in terms of the methane, and that contributes towards, it has its own fair contribution towards global greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, again, if you start to look a little bit into the different animal categories, you've got the buffalo having around 404 grams per protein that of these methane emission, compared to things like beef, where you have 295, through to things like chicken, which seems to have slightly less impact with having 35 grams of methane gas emission per gram of protein, which is, of course, global estimates in grams CO2 equivalent. And if you start to map this a little bit more into detail, so you're going back into breaking it down to see, supposing today, I would like to produce 100 grams of protein. How much of that is going to contribute towards the greenhouse gas emission equivalent of CO2? When you're looking at, of course, bovine meat, so you've got the beef herds and the beef does seem to be a higher emitter, which of course comes from just the animal being able to bulge out there, as we said already. And of course, the crustaceans, the bovine meat, dairy herd have their fair share of greenhouse gases that are emitted. But when you start to look at the plants, it does seem a little bit much more less in terms of these GHG gases, with things like nuts being being ranked to have about just 0.3 emission for CO2 equivalent from protein-rich food that are made from nuts. And that makes one to think like, okay, so does it mean that plants are much more low in terms of the GHG? And how can we end up in the end with a production that is more sustainable? Should we end up with more plants, or should we end up with animals? Or where is the question? Where is the balance that we can look at the end of the day? So I'm going to talk a little bit about alternative protein sources. Obviously, from the figures that I've shown, it does seem like animal production does have an impact on these GHGs. And so let's try to see, if we're looking for alternatives to proteins from animal sources, what are some of the things that can be used? We know that at the moment, there are different types of proteins that have been used. And of course, now I've already started to give a few differences between animal and plant. So obviously, plant-based protein is one of the alternatives. You have things like bacterial protein. You have things like fungal protein, which is the mycoprotein. If you've ever eaten corn, is a very good example of mycoprotein, where they harvest these fungi and then they restructure it into different structuring ingredients, and this can be used to produce chicken, mincemeat, etc. Then we've got the microalgal, we have the insect protein, and these are the so-called single-cell proteins. And then we have got the lab-grown meat, which is something, again, an area to look into a little bit more details when it comes to these lab-based or plant-based alternative proteins, all the same. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more into plant-based meats or protein, because if I try to kind of talk about all these individual things at the end of the day, I think I will need to take more than a day to be able to explain all these things. But today, I'm just going to focus a little bit onto the plant-based as an alternative protein to animal sources. If we look at this graphic here, you will see where I did a review on alternative protein sources. I looked at the extraction, their functional characteristics or characterization, applications, nutritional value, and I looked as well at the pinch points of them being the solution to sustainable proteins. There are a myriad of different plants that can be used in the extraction of proteins. They range from things like legumes, so you have faba beans, soya beans, lentils, etc. Or you can have the nuts, where you have things like walnuts, macadamia nuts, etc. You have the pseudonuts, the chias, the amaranth, so you can have tubers, you can have cereals, or you can have, again, the edible seeds or the oil seeds. All of which can be assembled into, or a protein can also be extracted from them and can be used as a source of alternative protein to animal proteins. So I'm going to go straight into applications of some of these plant-based material into the production of these alternative meats. You might be asking yourself, why am I going into just these alternative or fox meats when in reality, my presentation today is on alternative process as a sustainable source of protein production or sustainability solution? But when you try to think about this is one of the areas that has become very common at the moment. Everyone is talking about these alternative meat products or these meat substitutes. Everyone is talking about all these dairy alternatives in terms of the milk as well, or these milk drinks that can be used as dairy alternatives. And of course, because if I start to talk about the milk alternatives and start to talk about the meat alternatives, this can take, again, another whole time to talk about them. I just want to focus a little bit into some of the applications which can be used. And I believe one of my colleagues in this online symposium will also be talking a little bit about some of this fabrication of these alternative meats and things like that. And hence the reason why I chose to talk about these alternative proteins as a source of meat, fox meat fabrication. Plant-based meat analogs They are also most of the time called meat substitutes, can be called meat, mock meats, are plant-based products. Most of the time they are produced from plant-based materials. And when you're looking at these, in the end, of course, the plants remain to be the main source of the biomass that is used to substitute meat. You might be asking yourself why? Because of course, their availability, their cost of production. But again, it tends to be much more easier for the consumers to accept these meats when they are produced, for example, from plant sources compared to when they're produced from things like lab-grown meats, etc. When you're going to look at in terms of the designing of these products, they are designed in such a way that they will mimic the appearance, the flavor, and the fibrous texture of animal meat. So at the end of the day, remember, if you're trying to produce something that will mimic a meat, it needs to look like, feel like, probably taste like meat in order for the final consumer to be able to accept it. Because at the end of the day, the consumer is key. The consumer is king in terms of their perception and in terms of the acceptance of the product for it to end up being accepted as a success, or if it fails, it all depends on things like appearance, flavor, and fibrous texture. So when you're trying to think of these non-animal protein sources that have been used in terms of the substitutes to become substitutes of these animal proteins in meat-free products, you have things like cereals. So again, if you remember the slide that I showed a couple of minutes ago, you've got the vegetables, you've got legumes, you can get things like, of course, microalgae and fungi, which is something that I've already mentioned, the case of mycoprotein, which is used in corn products. These can be used in things like sausages, burger patties, and nuggets, etc. And they use them again in various fabrication processes, which I will talk a little bit about them in a couple of minutes' time. So let's go a little bit into the processing. You start off with the raw material selection. You decide, maybe I want to use soya, or I want to use whatever legume I'm using, corn, whatever it is. So you select your material, and after you do the selection, you always have to go to the next step, which is the plant protein isolation. There are different ways that can be used in isolating the protein. You can either carry out things like acid precipitation, you can use things like dry fractionation, various methods of processing of this protein and isolating it. Once you've done that protein isolation, you can end up with either an isolated protein, so a protein isolate. Isolates tend to be much more better in terms of their solubility, tends to be higher, and in terms of the protein content as well, it tends to be higher. Or you can end up with a concentrate protein or protein concentrate, which tends to be a little bit lower in terms of solubility as well as the protein content. Or you can have a bean flour, which can include other things in there. So for example, if you want to use lupin bean flour protein to be able to kind of in a way fabricate this meat, just remember it's not only the protein that you have in the flour, but the flour can contain other things as well. There will be some starch in there. There will be some other elements that are not protein in there. So something to be careful and to think about. So once you have these isolates, you go into the process of formulation. Normally, you will need to add some fat because, of course, sometimes you might want to make an emulsion, which is just a mixture of fats and oils or fats and water. You can add things like pigments. You can add things like flavoring compounds in there. And then through different processing, you end up with this plant-based meat alternative. So let's look a little bit on those processes that can be used to produce these meat alternatives. Extrusion technology has been well used and vastly used in the production of these meat alternatives, where you have this extruder, you feed in the meat that you have once you've done from the first slide that I just showed you guys. So you've done your formulation. You could have soya, you could have lupin, you could have pea, you could have wheat, wherever that you have there. So you feed it into the feeding zone, and then you mix that up, melt it, mold it, cool it. You end up with this kind of a matrix or scaffold that gives you the extruded alternative meat product. You can use as well 3D printing technology. This is something that has been done by several companies, particularly in places like Israel. There's been kind of a commissioning where they've done 3D printing of these meat alternatives, where you just do the emulsification. And again, as I mentioned, emulsion is just a mixing of oil and water in a matrix, and then you homogenize, break down those fat particles, allow them to kind of in a way coat around the protein particles. You fill these in the tube, and then you do the printing and molding. Obviously, there are some challenges that have been seen in terms of the texture, can look like meat, but again, in terms of the flavor, in terms of things like the taste as well, has still remains to be something of a challenge that needs to be sorted out. You can also do shear cell processing technology, where you mix and then you take everything into this shear cell. And once you do the shear molding, you end up with a scaffolding, again, that can be used as a fibrous texture. And this is where, if you've ever heard about fibrils or fibrils, these are structures that can be made by the shear cell. And the whole point where they started making these fibrils was to kind of use them as a starting point to be able to produce these scaffolding or textures that can be used for meat alternatives. You can as well carry out spinning technologies, things like electrospinning, wet spinning, all those have been used, and these have been successfully incorporated in these meat alternatives. But I'm using the word successfully a little bit lightly here, because success just means you can end up with something that looks like texture of a meat alternative, but it doesn't necessarily mean it will taste like it will feel like it, etc. Then, of course, there is the refrigeration structure, which is a bit interesting here, because you mix, you dissolve, mold, you fry, you freeze and mold, again, at the end of the day, to end up with this structure that you need to end up as a meat alternative. There is one of the things that I want to think about when it comes to all these processes. They might look really amazing, and they may really look great when it comes to this production of these alternative meats. But again, some of these potential challenges. Most of these products that emanate from this processing, they are actually classified to be ultra processed foods. And of course, we know that with this NOVA classification, depending on how the processes have undergone, the healthiness of ultra processed food is something that continues to be controversial at the moment, because of course there are potential health issues. And of course, and again, something to think about, things like obesity, cardiovascular diseases. And if you're going to classify these plant-based meat alternatives as being ultra-processed food, it might be, yes, probably there's something to do with them being more sustainable. But then in terms of health, are they really going to still be sustainable, or are they still going to be something that can end up with some health issues? And therefore, fermentation has played some key vital roles in the recent years to make these plant-based alternatives with minimal additives or processing. And I'm delighted that one of the presenters in this forum has been talking about opportunities and challenges in fermentation of whole biomass versus target compounds for production of alternative protein. And probably that's something that they may cover, and something worth looking at and tagging back to this presentation and to this talk, to just see how these different processes can be impacted or can be used as alternatives to production of these alternative meats, so that at the end of the day, they are slightly much more better in terms of health and in terms of the environment. So in terms of the ingredients that can be used, for sure, when it comes to these meat analogs, there are a variety of the ingredients that have been used and have been used successfully, again, as I say, depending on what you vary and what you really define as being success. So things like soya, of course, we know soya has been around for a long time. Textured soy protein has been one of the things that has been used a lot in this area. We know that, again, things like pea has started coming into production as well, and there's some research that has been done as well. Things like wheat gluten isolate, and they've been used to produce a range of things like burgers, sausages, pates, etc. And this is something that a colleague of mine and myself did review a couple of weeks ago, which is a work that has been published, and just looking at those different processes that have been used and the roles of those different processes and these processing ingredients in terms of this production of the meat analogs. When you start to think about it now, as I come towards landing of my talk, starting to think about, it does look like very interesting. There is the technology that we need and more technologies coming up. It's not the end of technology in terms of these meat-based products. There is all the plants that actually lend themselves so nicely to be able to be used as per se as being alternative meat products, isn't it? But when you start to look at it in terms of the environmental impact of these plant-based fractions, when you're using them in the main matrix of the meat substitute, you can see there's quite a good share of these greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, again, when it comes to these land use, when you have these alternative proteins, particularly in plants. And of course, depending on what you are using, whether you're using it, the grains by themselves, you're using the flour, or you're going an extra mile of carrying out these a production of either isolates or concentrates of the proteins. As I mentioned, the difference between the isolate and the concentrates earlier on, you're starting to increase how much of these greenhouse gases you're emitting the moment you start to go into processing, so that you end up like with a processed product and using that either an isolate, a concentrate, or the flour, and incorporating it back into this production of the meat substitutes. And so one of the key things that I would love you guys to realize is that plant-based foods in the human diet, if you're thinking of like the raw grains in the human diet, it will be seen to be twice as low with the GHG emissions, so the greenhouse gas emissions, which looks really fantastic. But when you start to go into these substitutes, somehow they will still look like, okay, they are still low in the greenhouse gas emissions, which is a positive thing again for the environment. However, the moment you start to process them and you end up with these plant-based meat substitutes, they have about 1.6 to 7 times higher environmental impact compared to whether you're just having, let's say, the plant itself or the grain itself. And there's a project that was done by Protein to Food, which identified, particularly if you're doing things like extrusion, which was the first method that I talked about, these extruded plant-based meat substitutes can actually, in some conditions, have a carbon footprint very close to chicken meat in terms of the resources, demand for water, demand for energy, demand for land, and actually could even be higher. And it brings me back to that question. In this case, do you still think that plant-based alternatives or these alternative proteins, are they still sustainable in terms of their use compared to the original animal products? Let's look at another thing, which is the water footprint of these alternative proteins. If you start to look at it in terms of eutrophication, which is just the gradual increase in the concentration of phosphorus, nitrogen, and other plant nutrients in an aging aquatic ecosystem such as a lake, when you're using all these alternative proteins and starting to use them into production of these fox meats or these mock meats, and then at the end of the day, when the waste end up into like streams of water, in terms of waste, like things like freshwater eutrophication, it's like the ingredients that contribute quite a great amount on the water footprint. When it comes to the water consumption, you've got about ingredients, quite a good proportion. Again, the processing takes quite some amount of water. And in terms of the packaging as well, there's quite an amount of water that is needed in the end. Looking again, as well as marine eutrophication, freshwater ecotoxicity, all these things, we need to look at them, look at the water footprint of meat analogs, and then try to look at it in terms of they've done a life cycle assessment. And this does show that as much as if you look at it in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions, it does look like plant proteins or these alternative proteins are really better. So everybody's championing, let's go for them, let's use most of them. But when you start to look again, on the other hand, where you're looking at the water footprint, there is still some work that still needs to be done. There is still some work for us to be able to attain these UN sustainability goals, development sustainable goals. It's something, again, we have to look at it in terms of this processing. And to talk a little bit more into this water footprint of these alternative proteins, if you ever heard of Impossible Burger or the Bleeding Burger from America, this is something that they say it is soy protein concentrate based, but of course it's just the legume that is gotten from the soy, where they extract it and then they take it into the lab, and then they've done some engineering to get multiples of that protein that can bleed like normal plant protein or normal meat, sorry. And this actually, if you're going to try to go down the route of producing this Impossible Burger, has increased water consumption to 106 liters equivalent per kilogram for you to be able to produce that burger. When it comes to things like the water footprint for an average plant-based meat substitute in scope, you'll find about 3.8 meters cubed per kilogram of this higher water footprint. This again might be connected to things like, as I said, when you're having isolates versus if you're having concentrates. If you're starting to process the protein further, you're going away from the original plant and you're starting to kind of process it into the protein isolate, concentrate, or flour that you need in order to be able to produce this product, which of course at the end of the day, don't forget when these food producers are going to be selling this, they're selling it as a source of protein. So it has to be the protein that makes the difference. But when you start to look at isolating it so that you end up with something that is slightly higher in terms of the protein content, it has got its own issues and something to think about. And this is something that colleagues of mine as well last year, we wrote a review article in terms of the extraction and characterization of these alternative meats again, of these plant-based meats as an alternative source of protein. And we looked at the differences in terms of things like soya. If you just have soy itself and you eat your soya as part of your normal meal, that seems to be much more better in terms of these greenhouse gas emissions, of course. But when you start to isolate it, isolation of soy consumes about 3 times more water compared to if you're having a texturized soy protein that you can use to produce whatever product that you want to produce. But when you're looking again in those fabrication, which I didn't go into much details because of time, when you start to fabricate those meats, I mentioned emulsions before. Those emulsions, you need to have oil in there. And in most cases, they use soybean oil. And soybean oil, or they can use sunflower oil, or by looking at just, for example, soybean oil, you need 7 times more of water to be able to produce that. And at the end of the day, if you want to go even more into the production of that soy protein isolate, you need for 1 kg of isolated soya, you need about 40,000 liters of water, which of course is not a sustainable solution. And this is something, again, that we need to think about as I draw towards the conclusion or the end of my talk today. It is something that we need to be careful about, and it's something that we need to think about when you think about, is really alternative proteins the solution to sustainability? There should be questions coming to your mind and thinking like, well, I can be kind of in one way reducing this greenhouse gas emission because there are no animals, there's no belching of animals. So at the end of the day, it might be better in terms of the environment. But then if I need much more water, what am I looking at? So one of the things that I would like to highlight as I bring this talk to an end is that the impact of these meat substitutes is determined by the impact of the main ingredient in the matrix. As I mentioned before, if you have like flour or you have the original plant, the moment you start to process it, at the end of it all, you're increasing the cost of production. And in some cases, I showed before, you can end up with similar production costs, like just having chicken, rather than going through the process of extruding plant to end up with something that looks like a chicken as a substitute of a chicken. And then when you're trying to think about all these things as well, there is something that I think about, and this is one of the things that I really am more interested in terms of my research and in terms of the things that I've been doing over the last couple of years. as I've continued to study and to research on this topic, I've actually ended up coming to kind of sort of a conclusion that it does seem somehow that this adoption of all these alternative proteins that we are talking about, in order for them to be effectively used in the production of these fox or alternative or mock meats, which might seem, again, as I said, a good solution for sustainability, there seems to be some of these issues that have locked this whole production into increasing production costs. And of course, if increasing production cost occurs, those costs will be passed down to the final consumer. So it's not going to be just the producers that absorb the cost, but if they are absorbing the cost, eventually, of course, the food industry needs to make some profits out of this production. The cost will automatically come down to the final consumer. And of course, if there's those increasing production costs, increasing cost to the final consumer, then at the end of the day, there's something to think about. Are they consumer willing to pay in terms of things like premium prices to be able to get these products? If the answer is no, it goes back into the failure of the product. Again, consumer perception and acceptance is something that is very key and important. It's kind of a vicious cycle where these alternative proteins can easily be locked in. For example, if you're trying, I haven't gone into talking about lab-based cultured meat, but if you're going to go into lab-based cultured meats, for example, to try and isolate and use them as meat alternatives, if people start to look at them and think, are they GMOs? Are they genetically modified? If they're producing cells from an animal or things like that, does it mean that at the end of the day, can it be classified as being suitable for, let's say, various population groups? In terms of, as well, some communities begin to look at these alternatives and they're like, well, it means our livelihood is based on meat, is based on production of livestock. So these guys are trying to take away our livelihood, and they can be as well some of those challenges in adoption and as well the perception and acceptance of these products. I've already mentioned things to do with the test. I've mentioned things to do with the texture, and all those contribute at the end of the day in terms of the consumer being able to accept or decline these products. Again, we have things like technological challenges, isn't it? To mimic the texture and the taste of these proteins from animal sources is something that is very difficult. As I mentioned, for example, there's the 3D printing that has continued to be carried out in terms of in Israel, for example. Even though they have managed to 3D print and to come up with a texture that looks so similar to the texture of meat, but there's still a challenge because at the end of the day, the taste has not yet mimicked the taste of meat. And that's something, again, that continues to become a headache and something that needs to be sorted out in terms of for these alternative proteins in food production to be able to be a viable thing to be done. The other thing as well to think about is for us to be able to evaluate whether these proteins as the solution to animal proteins as a sustainable solution, this cycle needs to be broken. And something needs to be done in order for this cycle to be broken, so that at the end of the day, when you're talking about sustainability of these alternative proteins, we're talking about it in terms of, okay, they are low in greenhouse gas emissions, but again, are they going to be of an impact, or are they going to impact on the environment, such as things like water consumption, as I mentioned? So I would like to thank you very much for your kind listening to this talk. And at this stage, I would like to open the floor for any questions.
Thank you very much, Claire, for sharing your expertise in the field. We will now move on to the Q&A session. And for your first question, what are some key issues in terms of product development when it comes to the adoption of alternative proteins in food production?
The first key thing to think about when it comes to this product development is to kind of understand, as I've mentioned throughout my talk today, that one, when you're trying to look at these proteins, the proteins need to be able to kind of, in a way, mimic the original product that you have, mimic the animal proteins. And we know for sure so much research has been done that shows that animal proteins are superior in terms of their protein content, in terms of their amino acid composition, in terms of their health benefits, their absorption and bioavailability. And so when you're starting to do product development and you're trying to bring these proteins into the product development, you need to ensure that this protein will function in a similar way, do the same thing, but most of the time, because of the inherent differences between plants and animals, it gets to a point that is very difficult by nature to kind of mimic this. And so you find if you're going to try to introduce these alternative proteins, you'll find troubles to do with texture, which is something hopefully throughout this presentation and talk, I've been able to highlight it. Things like taste, it becomes another issue. Things like the color, etc. Recently, I did a very interesting, like it was just kind of a quick sensory evaluation with a couple of my students, and I was showing them the differences between a vegan cheese and a normal cheese. And when we started to look at the label in terms of ingredients, the vegan cheese had almost 10, 15 ingredients on the label compared to the normal cheese, which is just milk, because they have to add in all those different ingredients to try and mimic this texture profile, to mimic this flavor profile. And that's a very big technological challenge, let alone the nutritional value and things like that.
If you think that there is a vicious cycle that needs to be broken before alternative proteins can become the solution to sustainability, are there any ways in which this cycle can be broken?
That's a really good question as well. I think in terms of it being broken, it's something that you have to think about. The problem that I strongly feel exists here in breaking this cycle is because people, for example, the animal scientists are locked in their own bubble and they're talking about gases and emissions and let's see what can we do in terms of that. And then we have another bubble where we have those people who are against the animal production and they're talking about animal production is not sustainable, let's do something about it. And then some are going into the water and so it's so many different people doing different things. But I think we need to come together, people, various stakeholders come together and start talking about these things together, and a concerted effort, everybody on board, can actually result in a breaking of this cycle. Because if you're trying to look at the plant people will say, okay, have you looked at these in terms of maybe the water consumption? But the animal people will say, have you looked at it in terms of how much meat are we consuming? Should we try to reduce the consumption so that at the end of the day, we are increasing we are reducing the amount of meat that we need and the supply in the first place, so that at the end of the day, we are producing less, but we are still benefiting from those bioavailability and high protein content of the animals versus the other. So it's kind of everybody coming together and talking on the same level, same page, for us to be able to break that vicious cycle.
Thank you for that great answer. Moving on to your next question, what are some of the challenges that you have faced when working with alternative proteins?
Another great question there. I think that for me, the biggest challenge that I've faced is the protein content. Because when I mentioned this before, for example, I've just mentioned the case of cheese. There's a time that I went off meat for 6 months, and I wanted just to say, so that when I talk about alternative proteins, I'm talking from a point of being informed. And I started to try to think of like, okay, I'm going to go eat more. I loved cheese. So I was like, let me try to eat vegan cheese. And when you go to buy and you realize it's only 1 gram of protein by 100 gram for 100 gram of product, you're like, am I eating protein really? And I'm not shocked with that, because having worked with protein extractions and isolations for over 10 years, I realized it's so easy. If you start to isolate, the processes are very straightforward. But then when you start to concentrate the protein, you need to get rid of the water. Maybe you're drying, you're using freeze drying or spray drying. It changes the structure. And now the protein cannot be soluble anymore. And if the protein is not soluble anymore, you cannot use it effectively in a matrix. So that is one of the key things. And of course, because of time, I cannot be able to talk about many other things. But of course, for me, that has been the headache of trying to work with alternative proteins.
Thank you, Claire. It looks like we have some more time to answer a few more questions. Your next question is, do you think that innovation is the best way to create food to feed the growing population, and this will work well for things like meat and dairy alternatives?
I'm not so particularly sure that innovation is going to be the key. It's a great thing and it's a lovely thing. I see so much coming in terms of so many innovations. As I say, like 3D printing at the moment is something that is being carried out to produce these meat alternatives, etc. But I strongly believe and I strongly feel like probably instead of us innovating, we should go back to the drawing board and think about things like food waste. This is something that is really, well, there's some work that is going around at the moment and being done with movements like Too Good to Go and RAP UK contributing towards the issues to do with food waste. But I strongly feel like if we innovate too much, but we don't know much what we want to do with the food, we might end up with these processes, productions that at the end of the day look so nice to produce meat alternatives that will end up in the bin. And at the end of the day, it's like that innovation or that idea has actually not been successful, because at the end of it all, if the consumer are buying the product, they're taking it home, they're trying to cook it, they have no idea how to cook it, and then it ends up in the bin. It's like that innovation has basically been not successful. But what about if you go back into starting to think about, okay, how can we waste less food so that at the end of the day, the resources that we have, we can try to understand if these resources will be able to be distributed globally to the people around the different nations. And today, somebody will go hungry the whole night. Maybe somebody will die of starvation where we have someone else throwing a lot of food in the bin. So in the end, just to answer this question without taking too much time, innovation is great. Let's continue to innovate, but let's think about what we're innovating and how innovation can help, but rather thinking of also on top of that, how can we waste less food? How can we educate consumers? If you have these alternative meats, as I said, in some populations, they will view them as an enemy, isn't it? Because they'll be thinking like, oh, these are people that are trying to steal away our meat consumption. But then if you try to educate the consumer to know what can you do with those ingredients, how can you cook minced meat that is from alternative meat, what are, let's say, the health or nutritional consequences, something again to think about.
Thank you, Claire. We do have some time for one final question for today, and the closing question will be, where do you see the future of meat substitutes?
That's a very good question. I feel like there is potential for the meat substitutes. There is a lot of, we know that there is a lot of demand for this, obviously, but I feel like for this future to continue being bright, because if you've done any research on this area, as I mentioned, I just published a review article 4 weeks, maybe a couple of weeks ago. And if you look at them in terms of the potential, it continues to rise with the demand and the supply, and these meat alternatives and dairy alternatives continue to be leading, and their market share is exploding. But then I think for it to continue to explode, and there's potential, and there are predictions that these will continue to become more and more in years to come, these fundamental issues need to be sorted out in terms of things like taste, consumer perception, in terms of the acceptability, education, because these meat products alternatives can be used, for example, when there are periods of earthquakes, famine, wars, and things like that to feed the population. But of course, again, thinking about when you start to introduce in many more other ingredients, additives, for example, what are you doing to the final product? And it's something that we have to be careful. But I think there is so much potential in this area. It just kind of to watch if the cycle can be broken so that at the end of the day, they become actually sustainable, because at the moment, there's still some work that still needs to be done.
Thank you so much, Claire. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. Any questions that we didn't have time to get to will be sent to the speaker after the event. While you're here, don't forget to check out all of the free to download literature and resources available below the live stream player. And as with all the other talks in the event, this talk will now be available to view whenever you want for the next 30 days. That just leaves me to say thanks again to Dr. Claire Munialo for her excellent talk. And for everyone watching, we will be back tomorrow at 8 a.m. Pacific time with some more great talks from our sponsors and partners. Goodbye.